At 3:07 a.m. on October 11, 1969, a telephone rang at the San Francisco Police Department. The man on the other end was calm. He didn't raise his voice. He simply told the dispatcher that he was the one who had shot a taxi driver named Paul Stine in the face 20 minutes earlier. Then he said something strange. He said he wanted to report the crime before the news did. After hanging up, he walked away from the phone booth, crossed the street, and disappeared into the shadows of Washington Square. The police arrived 4 minutes later. They surrounded the area. They set up roadblocks. They had witnesses who had seen him leave the scene. But what no one realized at the time was that the man in the shadows had just walked right past a patrol car. The officer inside had no idea. And by the time anyone understood what had just happened, the truth was already right in front of them. They just didn't see it. 5 killers, each one standing at the edge of justice, about to slip through the cracks forever. Some of them would remain free for decades. Others would die before anyone knew their names. And in each case, the reason they almost got away wasn't a lack of evidence. It wasn't bad luck. It was one detail everyone overlooked. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what went wrong in each of these investigations. And more importantly, you'll understand why it mattered. This is Behind the Crime Files, where we explore the stories, psychology, and motives behind real crimes. Before we begin, let me introduce you to the 5 killers whose stories you're about to hear. The first is a man who called himself the Zodiac. He murdered at least 5 people in Northern California between 1968 and 1969. He taunted police with letters and ciphers. And on the night of his last confirmed murder, he walked right past a police officer who had stopped to ask him for directions. The officer let him go. The second is a man named James Vainest. In 1981, he killed an 18-year-old girl named Deborah Lee Miller in Mansfield, Ohio. He lived 40 years as a free man. He was identified through DNA in 2024, but he died in a shootout with police before he could be arrested for her murder. The third is a man named Ryland Headley. In 1967, he raped and murdered a 75-year-old widow named Louisa Dunn in Bristol, England. For 58 years, he lived in plain sight. He was convicted in 2024 at the age of 92. It was the longest cold case ever solved in the United Kingdom. The fourth is not one man but a network. They called themselves the Family. In Adelaide, Australia, between 1979 and 1983, they kidnapped, tortured, and murdered at least 5 teenage boys. One of their members was convicted. The others never faced justice. To this day, their identities remain unknown. The fifth is a woman named Elisa Lam. In 2013, her body was found in a water tank on the roof of the Cecil Hotel in Los Angeles. The circumstances of her death were so strange that millions of people believed she must have been murdered. But the truth was something else entirely. Something that raises questions about what we see and what we choose to believe. 5 killers. 5 cases. 5 reasons they almost got away. Let's begin. Case 1. The Zodiac. Paul Stine lived in San Francisco. He was 39 years old. He drove a taxi because he needed the money, like so many men did in 1969. He had a wife. He had children. By all accounts, his life was ordinary, predictable, safe. He picked up fares, dropped them off, collected his cash. It was routine work. The kind of job where the most dangerous thing is usually the traffic. No one expected that night to be different. On the night of October 11, 1969, at around 9:30 p.m., Paul Stine picked up a fare at the intersection of Mason and Geary Streets. The passenger was a white male in his late 20s or early 30s. He wore glasses. He had short hair. He looked like any other fare Stine had picked up 1,000 times before. The passenger asked to be taken to Washington and Maple Streets, in the Presidio Heights neighborhood. It was an affluent area. Quiet, tree-lined, the kind of place where nothing ever happens. At first, it didn't seem alarming. The drive took about 15 minutes. When they arrived, the passenger leaned forward. Stine probably thought he was reaching for his wallet. Instead, the man put a 9mm Luger to the right side of Stine's head and pulled the trigger. The bullet entered just above the ear. Stein died instantly. His body slumped against the driver's side door. The killer reached over, took Stein's wallet, took the cash from the fare box, and tore off a piece of Stein's bloody shirt as a souvenir. Then he got out and walked away. 3 teenagers sitting in a house across the street saw the whole thing. They saw the flash of the gun through the window. They saw a man in a dark jacket walk away from the taxi. They called the police. But there was one detail that didn't sit right with investigators. When the teenagers described the man they saw, they said he was black. The dispatcher put out a description over the radio. A black male adult, last seen wearing a dark jacket, heading east on Washington Street. Officers flooded the area. 2 blocks away, a patrol car sat at an intersection. Inside, Officer Donald Fouke and his partner watched a man walk past them on the sidewalk. The man was white. He was wearing a dark jacket. He was heading east on Washington Street. Fouke rolled down his window and asked if he'd seen anyone matching the description. The man said he'd seen a guy with a gun running toward the park a few minutes ago. He pointed. Fouke thanked him and drove on. At the time, that interaction was dismissed as insignificant. The man was white. The suspect was described as black. It didn't fit, so they let him go. Later, it would become impossible to ignore. Criminal psychologists later noted something important about this behavior. The killer didn't run. He didn't hide. He walked. At 3:07 a.m., when he called the police to confess, his voice was steady. He was calm. He was precise. When the officer asked him where the crime had occurred, he corrected the officer's pronunciation of the street name. This wasn't panic. It was control. The Zodiac Killer, as he would later call himself, had a psychological need to insert himself into the investigation. He needed to be part of the story. He needed to watch the police fail in real time. And when he walked past that patrol car, when he watched the officer roll down the window and ask for his help, he wasn't afraid. He was experiencing something far more satisfying. He was winning. Everything changed when the first letter arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle on October 14, 1969. Inside was a piece of Paul Stein's bloody shirt. The letter was addressed to the police. It began with a phrase that would become infamous. "This is the Zodiac speaking." In the letter, the killer bragged about the Stein murder. But he also included a detail that only someone who had been there would know. He described the exact intersection where Stein picked him up. He described the route they took. He described how he had wiped down the cab to remove his fingerprints. And then he wrote something that made the detective's blood run cold. He mentioned the patrol car. He mentioned the officer who had rolled down the window and asked for his help. He described the interaction perfectly. Officer Donald Fouke was called in for questioning. He was shown photographs. He was asked to describe the man he had seen. When he finished, the room went quiet. The man he described was white. The man he described had glasses. The man he described was the Zodiac Killer. And he had let him go. The truth was far more calculated than anyone expected. The Zodiac Killer wasn't just a murderer. He was a student of police procedure. He understood how investigations worked. He knew that descriptions change. He knew that eyewitness testimony is unreliable. And he knew that if he could make the police look for a black suspect, they would never see a white man walking right past them. When he walked past Officer Fouke that night, he wasn't just lucky. He was executing a plan. He had chosen his victim in a neighborhood where the witnesses would be across the street, watching through a window in low light. He had worn a jacket that could be described in generic terms. And when the teenagers described him as black, he knew exactly what that meant for the police response. He could walk right through the perimeter. He could talk to the officers. And they would never know. The piece of Stein's shirt he sent to the newspaper wasn't just a trophy. It was proof. Proof that he had been there. Proof that he had gotten away. And proof that he could do it again. The Zodiac Killer was never identified. He sent his last confirmed letter in 1974, claiming to have killed 37 people. The actual count is probably lower, but the exact number will never be known. The case left behind more questions than answers. For the families of the victims, nothing was ever the same. For Officer Donald Fouke, The guilt of that encounter haunted him for the rest of his life. He had been 2 feet away from one of the most notorious killers in American history. He had asked him for directions, and he had let him go. Case 2. James Vainest. Deborah Lee Miller lived in Mansfield, Ohio. She was 18 years old. She had just graduated from high school. She worked at a local restaurant. She lived alone in a small apartment on the 2nd floor of an old building on West 4th Street. By all accounts, she was just starting to build her life. She had friends. She had a boyfriend. She had dreams of something more than Mansfield. No one expected that night to be different. On the night of April 28, 1981, at around 11 p.m., Deborah was seen at a local bar called the Brass Rail. She was with friends. She was laughing. She was having a good time. At some point, she met a man who lived in her building. His name was James Vainest. He was 32 years old. He lived in the apartment directly above hers. They talked. They had a few drinks. And at some point, they left together. At first, it didn't seem alarming. The next morning, Deborah didn't show up for work. Her manager called. No answer. He called her friends. No one had seen her. He called the landlord. The landlord went to her apartment. The door was locked. He used his key. And when he opened the door, he found Deborah on the floor. She had been beaten to death. The attack was brutal. There was blood everywhere. Evidence suggested she had fought back. But in the end, it wasn't enough. But there was one detail that didn't sit right with investigators. When they interviewed James Vainest, he admitted to being with Deborah that night. He said they had consensual sex after meeting at the bar. He said he left around 2 a.m. He said she was alive when he left. But he also said something strange. He said he heard a loud thump from her apartment later that morning. He said he looked down through a hole in his floor and saw a man in her apartment. A man he didn't recognize. At the time, the story was taken seriously. Vainest was cooperative. He seemed helpful. He was just a neighbor who happened to be the last person to see her alive. There was no reason to suspect him. Later, it would become impossible to ignore. Criminal psychologists later noted something important about this behavior. Vainest didn't just claim to be the last person with Deborah. He inserted himself into the investigation in a specific way. He provided details that no one else could verify. He described a mysterious man that no one else ever saw. And he placed himself above her, looking down, watching. This wasn't the behavior of a helpful witness. This was the behavior of someone trying to control the narrative. Someone who wanted to be part of the investigation so he could steer it away from himself. Everything changed in 2021. For 40 years, the case had been cold. Evidence sat in storage. Witnesses died. Memories faded. But Detective Terry Butler decided to take another look. He requested the old evidence boxes. He sent items to a private DNA lab. And when the results came back, they found something that had been invisible in 1981. Male DNA on items from Deborah's apartment. DNA that didn't match anyone in the system at the time. But now, with modern technology, they could compare it to potential suspects. They asked James Vainest for a sample. He refused. He demanded a lawyer. That refusal was, in itself, evidence. In Ohio, police can't force a DNA sample without a warrant. But they could watch. And they could wait. The truth was far more calculated than anyone expected. Vainest had been living with this secret for 40 years. He had moved away from Mansfield. He had built a new life. He had probably convinced himself that he had gotten away with it. But when the detective called in 2021, he knew. His responses were cagey. He tried to establish an alibi. He repeated the same story about the mysterious man. But this time, no one believed him. In November 2024, federal agents went to arrest Vainest on an unrelated firearms charge. They found him at a motel in Canton, Ohio. When they tried to serve the warrant, Vainest barricaded himself inside. What followed was a standoff that ended in gunfire. An officer was wounded. Vainest was shot and killed. The DNA comparison was completed after his death. It was a match. James Vainest had killed Deborah Lee Miller in 1981, and he had almost gotten away with it. He had lived 40 years as a free man. He had died free. He never faced a jury. He never heard a verdict. He simply took the secret to his grave. The case left behind more questions than answers. For Deborah's family, the identification of her killer brought some closure, but not justice. They will never see him in a courtroom. They will never hear him explain what happened that night. The prosecutor's office had been preparing to take the case to a grand jury when Venus died. Now the case is closed. Solved, but not resolved. For those who loved Deborah, nothing was ever the same. Case 3. Ryland Headley. Louisa Dunn lived in Bristol, England. She was 75 years old. She was a mother of 2, a grandmother, a woman whose first husband had been a leading trade unionist. By 1967, she was living alone at 58 Britannia Road in the Easton neighborhood. She was twice widowed, but she wasn't reclusive. She had a group of women she met with regularly. They gossiped on doorsteps. They watched out for each other. She was very much part of the fabric of her community. No one expected that night to be different. On the night of June 23, 1967, at around 10 p.m., neighbors heard a noise from Louisa's house. But in that neighborhood, noises were common. One neighbor later told police that she had heard something, but the man behind her was always beating his wife, so she just assumed it was that. No one checked. No one called. At first, it didn't seem alarming. The next morning, Louisa didn't appear on her doorstep. She was always on her doorstep. Her friends noticed immediately. They knocked. No answer. They called through the letterbox. Nothing. They found a way in. And when they did, they found Louisa. She had been raped. She had been beaten. She had been strangled. The killer had entered through a rear window. Palm print was left behind. That was all. But there was one detail that didn't sit right with investigators. The killer had taken time after the murder. He hadn't just fled. He had arranged things. He had covered her. He had made the scene look almost peaceful. It wasn't the behavior of someone in a panic. It was the behavior of someone who felt comfortable. Someone who felt in control. At the time, that detail was noted but not emphasized. The investigation focused on the palm print. Police knocked on 8,000 doors. They took 19,000 palm prints. No match. The case went cold. The evidence boxes were moved from station to station. First to Kingswood, then to Weston-super-Mare, finally to a central archive in Portishead, where they sat for decades. Later, it would become impossible to ignore. Criminal psychologists later noted something important about this behavior. The covering of the victim, the arrangement of the scene, it showed a relationship with violence that was deeply ingrained. This wasn't someone who had snapped. This was someone who had fantasies. Someone who had probably done this before or would do it again. The need to control the scene, to leave it in a specific state, was more important than escape. He knew he had time. He knew he wouldn't be caught. And he was right. For 58 years. Everything changed in June 2023. Joe Smith, a major crime review officer for Avon and Somerset Police, was asked to look at the Louisa Dunn case. She went to the archive. She found 3 boxes. They weren't sealed in modern forensic bags. They just had brown cardboard luggage labels. They had never been examined with modern technology. She opened the first box. She put the lid back on immediately. Then she and a colleague spent the rest of the day gloved up, carefully bagging every item. They sent them to forensics, and then they waited. 8 months passed. Smith was told the case wasn't a priority. Live murders came first. But in August 2024, on the last day of her summer holiday, she got a message. Forensics had a full DNA profile from Louisa's skirt. A few hours later, another message. The profile matched someone in the database. Someone who was still alive. The name was Ryland Headley. He was 92 years old. He lived in Ipswich. And he had a history. In 1977, he had been convicted of raping 2 women in their own homes. They were 79 and 84 years old. The crimes were almost identical to Louisa's. Same method. Same type of victim. Same lack of forced entry. He talked his way in. At the time of those rapes, A psychiatrist had testified that Headley was acting out of character because of sexual frustration within his marriage. The court accepted this. His life sentence was reduced to 7 years. He served 4. He moved on with his life. He married. He widowed. He grew old. The investigation team read through all 1,300 statements. They searched city archives road by road. On the 3rd day, they found him. A record of a young man living in the area in 1967. The same man who would later rape 2 elderly women. The same man whose DNA was now on Louisa's skirt. In November 2024, police arrested Ryland Headley at his home in Ipswich. He was 92. He was frail. He seemed confused. But when they questioned him, he remembered. He remembered Louisa. He remembered what he had done. And on December 24, 2024, a jury found him guilty of rape and murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. 58 years. The longest cold case ever solved in the UK. Possibly in the world. The case left behind more questions than answers. For Dr. Norman Taylor, the GP who had attended the scene in 1967, the conviction brought a strange kind of peace. He was 89 years old. He had carried the memory of Louisa's body for nearly 6 decades. Every time he drove through that part of Bristol, he thought about her. He thought about the person who had done this, still out there, still free. Now he knew. Now it was over. For Jo Smith and her team, the case became proof that cold cases are never truly cold. Evidence doesn't disappear. It waits. For those who loved Louisa, nothing was ever the same. But now, at least, they know his name. Case 4. The family. Alan Barnes lived in Adelaide, Australia. He was 15 years old. He disappeared in 1979. Neil Muir was also 15. He disappeared in 1979. Richard Kelvin was 15. He was the son of a popular television news presenter. He disappeared in 1983. Peter Stogneff was 14. He disappeared in 1981. Mark Langley was 18. He disappeared in 1982. 5 boys. 5 families. 5 lives cut short. By all accounts, Adelaide in the late 1970s was a quiet city. Safe. Predictable. Parents let their children walk to friends' houses. They let them go to the shops alone. They didn't lock their doors at night. No one expected that to change. On a summer evening in 1979, Alan Barnes left his home and never came back. His body was found weeks later. He had been drugged. He had been raped. He had been tortured. He had been kept alive for weeks before he died. The same pattern emerged with each disappearance. Boys would vanish. Weeks later, their bodies would be found. They had all been held captive. They had all been subjected to repeated abuse. They had all been killed. At first, it didn't seem like the cases were connected. Different neighborhoods, different times, different circumstances. But investigators began to notice similarities. The drugs used, the methods of restraint, the injuries. Someone was taking these boys. Someone was keeping them. And someone was killing them. But there was one detail that didn't sit right with investigators. Many of the victims had been seen with a man named Bevan von Einem before they disappeared. Von Einem was not what anyone expected. He was a businessman. He was educated. He moved in social circles that included lawyers, doctors, and politicians. He didn't look like a killer. He didn't act like one. When police interviewed him, he was calm, cooperative, helpful. At the time, the connections seemed coincidental. Von Einem knew a lot of people. The boys might have been seen with anyone. It didn't prove anything. Later, it would become impossible to ignore. Criminal psychologists later noted something important about this behavior. Von Einem didn't just kill. He collected. He kept trophies. He documented his fantasies. And most importantly, he didn't act alone. The family, as investigators would later call them, was a loose network of men who shared victims. They would drug boys at parties. They would pass them around. They would keep them for weeks. This wasn't the work of a single predator. This was an organized group. And the group included people with power, people with money, people who could make investigations disappear. Everything changed in 1984. Richard Kelvin had been missing for months. Police were under pressure. His father was a public figure. The media was watching. Investigators focused on von Einem. They watched his movements. They interviewed his associates. And finally, they found enough evidence to arrest him for Richard Kelvin's murder. At trial, the evidence was overwhelming. Fibers from von Einem's car matched Richard's clothing. Witnesses placed them together. Von Einem was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. But Richard's murder was only one of 5. The others remained unsolved. And everyone knew that von Einem hadn't acted alone. The truth was far more calculated than anyone expected. The family wasn't just a group of friends who shared a dark secret. They were a network of men who had built their lives around protecting each other. They had money. They had influence. They had the resources to make problems go away. And when von Einem was caught, they closed ranks. They destroyed evidence. They silenced witnesses. They waited for the investigation to move on. Von Einem himself played the game perfectly. He never named names. He never cooperated with police. He served his time, was released, and was later rearrested on unrelated charges. He died in prison in 2023, taking the secrets of the family with him. The 4 other murders remain unsolved. At least 150 young men were drugged and raped during the family's active years. Most survived, but 5 never made it home. And the men who killed them are still free, or they died free. Either way, justice was never served. The case left behind more questions than answers. For the families of Alan Barnes, Neil Muir, Peter Stogneff, and Mark Langley, nothing was ever the same. They will never know who killed their sons. They will never see anyone held accountable. The investigation continues in theory, but in practice, the leads are cold. The witnesses are dead. The killers are gone. And Adelaide is left with a question it can never fully answer. Who were the family, and how did they get away with it for so long? Case 5. Elisa Lam. Elisa Lam lived in Vancouver, British Columbia. She was 21 years old. She was a student at the University of British Columbia, majoring in English literature. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, with dark hair and a smile that people remembered. By all accounts, her life was just beginning. She had friends. She had family who loved her. She had a Tumblr blog where she posted photos of her travels and wrote about her love of books and music. No one expected her trip to Los Angeles to be different. On January 26, 2013, at around 12:30 p.m., Elisa Lam checked into the Cecil Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. The hotel had a reputation. In the 1980s, serial killers Richard Ramirez and Jack Unterweger had both stayed there. But Elisa didn't know that. She was just a traveler looking for a cheap place to stay while she explored the city. She was assigned room 506. She posted photos on her blog of the view from her window. She seemed happy, excited. At first, it didn't seem alarming. On January 31st, Elisa was supposed to check out. She didn't show up at the front desk. Her family called the hotel. Staff checked her room. Her belongings were there. Her keys were there. But Elisa was gone. The Los Angeles Police Department opened a missing persons case. They distributed flyers. They asked for the public's help. Days passed. Then weeks. No one saw anything. No one heard anything. But there was one detail that didn't sit right with investigators. The hotel had security cameras. On the morning of February 1st, the day after Elisa was supposed to check out, the cameras recorded something strange. Elisa was in the elevator. She pressed multiple buttons. She stepped in and out of the elevator, looking around as if she was checking for something. She gestured with her hands. She appeared to be talking to someone who wasn't there. At one point, she stepped out of the frame, then stepped back in. The elevator doors tried to close, but she kept stopping them. Finally, she walked away. The doors closed. The elevator went to the next floor. At the time, the video was dismissed as confusing but not necessarily suspicious. People act strangely when they're alone in elevators. Maybe she was drunk. Maybe she was having a manic episode. Maybe she was just playing around. It didn't seem like evidence of a crime. Later, it would become impossible to ignore. Criminal psychologists later noted something important about this behavior. The video went viral after its release. Millions of people watched it. Theories exploded across the internet. Elisa was possessed. Elisa was being chased. Elisa was hiding from someone the camera couldn't see. But the experts saw something different. They saw dissociation. They saw someone who was not fully present in her own body. The repetitive movements. The seeming conversation with no one. The inability to complete a simple task like leaving an elevator. This wasn't someone running from danger. This was someone who was already lost. Everything changed on February 19, 2013. A maintenance worker at the Cecil Hotel received a complaint from guests on the 14th floor. The water pressure was low. The water tasted funny. He went up to the roof to check the water tanks. There were 4 of them, each holding hundreds of gallons. He opened the hatch on the 4th tank and looked inside. The body was floating face up. The worker ran. He called his supervisor. They drained the tank. And when the water level dropped, they saw her. Elisa Lam was naked. Her clothes were floating beside her. Her watch and room key were also in the tank. The hatch was heavy. It had been closed. How she got in there, no one could explain. The truth was far more calculated than anyone expected. The video that everyone watched, the one that seemed so strange, was actually the key to understanding what happened. Elisa was in the middle of a manic episode. Her bipolar medication had been adjusted recently. She had stopped taking it consistently. Her family later confirmed that she had episodes like this before. In those moments, she wasn't herself. She was confused. She was paranoid. She saw things that weren't there. When she got into that elevator, she wasn't running from a killer. She was running from something inside her own mind. The people she seemed to be talking to weren't real. The gestures, the hiding, the strange behavior, it was all part of a psychiatric crisis. She went to the roof because she was confused. She found the tank because the door was unlocked. She climbed in because the ladder was there. And when she fell, no one heard. No one knew. The hatch was heavy, but not impossible. She could have closed it from the inside, or it could have fallen closed on its own. Either way, she was trapped. And she drowned alone in the dark, with no one to hear her. The case left behind more questions than answers. For those who knew Elisa, nothing was ever the same. Her family accepted the coroner's ruling, but they will always wonder what happened in those final moments. The Cecil Hotel changed management. The roof doors were locked. The water tanks were secured. But for the guests who drank that water for 2 weeks before her body was found, the memory will never fade. They had been consuming the remains of a dead girl. And they didn't know until it was too late. 5 killers, each one standing at the edge of justice. The Zodiac, who walked past a police officer and was dismissed because he was the wrong color. James Vainest, who lived 40 years as a free man after beating a teenage girl to death. Ryland Headley, who waited 58 years for justice to catch up with him. The family, who built a network so powerful that some of its members probably died free. And Elisa Lam, whose death wasn't murder at all, but whose case shows us that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones inside our own minds. In each of these cases, the reason the killer almost got away wasn't a lack of evidence. It was a detail everyone overlooked. A description that didn't match. A story that seemed too convenient. A piece of evidence that sat in a box for 60 years. A network of powerful men who protected each other. These details didn't seem important at the time, but they were the key to everything. The lesson of these cases is simple but profound. Justice is not guaranteed. It is not automatic. It requires work. It requires attention to detail. It requires someone to look at a piece of evidence that has sat in a box for 60 years and ask the question, what if? It requires someone to question a description that doesn't match. It requires someone to keep digging when everyone else has given up. The evidence is waiting. The answers are there. They're in boxes in archives. They're in DNA samples that haven't been tested. They're in witness statements that haven't been reread. They're waiting for someone to look again, to ask the question, to dig a little deeper, because killers can run. They can hide. They can die. But the truth doesn't go anywhere. It waits. And eventually it finds a way out. Of these 5 cases, which one do you believe came closest to never being solved? What do you think investigators could have done differently in any of these investigations? If you're interested in the psychology and stories behind real crimes, subscribe to Behind the Crime Files.